All right, good morning, you guys. I appreciate Brooklyn inviting me to come speak to you today. I'm glad Brooklyn's still with Extension despite being my mentee. Vegetables are a big interest. Lots of people are wanting to grow their own food and have more food security and just understand the importance of growing. Here in Bibb County, we've had a unique opportunity to actually put in a vegetable garden at our homeless shelter. That's a fairly new project. So I think my comment would be to you guys, I don't know everything and I am learning new stuff every day. And if you are gardeners, I think you probably share the same experience as me. So I'm going to hit on some general things. We'll talk about a few crops in particular, but the main thing I want to do is plug you into resources and make you understand where to find stuff and where to find the right information about vegetable gardening. So with that, I'm going to click on through. Site selection for anything we're growing is the most important thing to get right. Getting everything prepared on the front end, whether we're talking about fruits or brambles or trees or vegetables or even ornamental plants, like so many of our homeowners like, getting things right on the front end goes such a long way. And that's true with vegetable gardening as well. So those of you who have been vegetable gardeners before, and those of you who are new, everybody needs to know and probably already knows that full sun is, you've just got to have full sun to have a vegetable garden. A good, easy way to figure out your sun so you don't have to guesstimate it is to put a flag out in the spot you're thinking of and take pictures once an hour, or get your teenagers to go out and take pictures every hour, whatever. I mean, it may be time consuming on the day of, but it's a real quick way to figure out where shade may fall. It's interesting just to see tree lines and different things casting shadows when and where you might not expect it. So understand where a good full sun spot is. That's one thing that's got to happen. If you've got some low areas and high areas to your topography, it's always good to understand too, with fruits and vegetables, that cold air tends to drain. So if you can plant further up the slope, that's going to help if we get any late season cold snaps, frost, dip in the night temperatures, things like that. So just understand, if you've got a choice in your yard between a higher spot and a lower spot, try to tend toward the higher areas. Soil is one thing we don't have a whole lot of control over. I live in Macon, so we're right on the fall line. We tend to have the best and worst of everything. We've got nice red clays, we've got good deep sands, and of course, we all strive to have this great loamy soil full of organic matter that's just perfect, is what we all want to go after. So if you're doing raised beds or containers, you've got a little bit of control over that from the get-go. If you're planting in ground, we know that that's something you've got to work on along the way. So soil is critical. We know that the sandier stuff with the bigger particles, we know we've got to keep watered more frequently. We know that fertilizers leach through more readily, more quickly. With the clay soils, the ones that tend to be more clayey, we've got all the particles that are smaller and compacted. It holds water like you would not believe. So each extreme has got its own challenges. So anything we can do to increase the organic matter over time is going to help with our planting sites. We don't really think about drainage unless we get to see it firsthand. This looks to be an area that was probably picked out for a gardening site or an ornamental site, and not until this group went out to look at it following a rain do you really understand where water stands, where it drains. We're getting drainage work done here at our building, and it's not until we have several days of good rain that we actually see where we're going to have to do a little bit more work. So understand where your water stands, where it drains. Last week at the out at the Brookdale Garden, which we've got here in Macon, the homeless shelter garden that I mentioned, we were doing a fruit class. We had pre-dug probably 12 holes for some fruit trees, and it had rained the day before. Every hole had drained very nicely except for one. And Susan, the garden manager, made the point to show everybody in the class that, hey, there's something else going on in this hole. And if there had not been a delay in planting those trees, that would have been a tree that would have been dead over time because it would have had root rot and the hole wouldn't have drained, but we would have had no idea what was going on. So if you've got any questions about your site, I would encourage you to do a little bit of work ahead of time, dig a hole, make sure it's going to drain and percolate like you would expect. Many of us are gardeners and we know where our problem spots are in the yard, but if you're especially working on a new site, spend a little bit of time ahead of time and be sure you know what you're starting with. We've got to get those hard pans and problem areas taken care of. Another thing to think of with a gardening site is just protecting your garden. I mean, deer are a huge problem. Fences may or may not help that, depending on what kind of fence you've got. Animals, dogs, cats roaming around in the yard. I looked out at my poor little raised bed last week, wanting to think about getting it ready for the spring, but we've got chickens now. We didn't have them last year, and I know good and well that the chickens, unless we put some kind of fence around the garden site, the chickens aren't going to let whatever we put out there exist. So think about what you need to put in place to protect your gardening spot as well. And go ahead and do that before you put the plants out, and it makes you have heartburn because things are getting dug up and eaten and all the other things that can happen. And of course, to me, convenience is such a big part of the whole situation. If you've got 5 acres and you put your garden on the very back of the lot where it's not on your mind when you're coming back from work and coming back from ball games with kids, it tends to be forgotten sometimes. Sometimes we're all busy and have busy lives. So having a spot that you can look out the back door or view coming up the driveway, something that's going to prompt you, that is convenient, that's convenient to water, that's convenient for you to move your tools and supplies back and forth to. Anything that's going to make your life easier is going to make your garden be more apt to be successful. So once we get the site picked out, the site's kind of going to guide our plan that we develop. So there's certain things we need to understand as part of the plan. Understanding space is one of those things, very basic and easy just to brush off and say, yeah, that's fine. But we all think we're real good at measuring space and judging space. Some of us are, but a lot of us are not. So getting out the tape measure or getting out the measuring wheel or stepping it off, understanding how much space you've got is going to be an important part of the planning side of things. We don't want to get things so packed in and just overshoot when we plant. We want to be able to have space for things to grow and air to circulate and things like that. So understand your space that you've got to work with for sure. We all know that traditional in-ground gardens, say, are the half acres or quarter of an acre, or our few rows that we've got out behind our house. It can be as big or small as you want it to be. There's, of course, pros and cons to in-ground gardens. The picture on the left is one behind a high-rise up in Atlanta, still an in-ground garden, a little bit more heavily managed and manicured. You'll notice the one on the left has got nice mulched layers in it, while the one on the right appears to be tilled between the rows. Raised beds are something that we talk a lot about in Macon, in an urban area where I deal a lot with homeowners who have got smaller lots. And in Macon, and probably in some of the more urban areas as well, there's concerns with lead contamination in the soil. So a raised bed is one way to mitigate that issue. It's also a good way to have a nice starting bed that we don't already have weed seeds in, and we don't have a lot of pest and disease pressure. We don't have a lot of compaction. So there's definite advantages to raised beds too. You can make raised beds out of lots of different stuff. It may be what you've got laying around on your property. You might want to grab it and use it. We discourage things like utility poles and railroad ties just because of the preservatives in those. People have got kind of mixed feelings on treated pine. Our specialists, our horticulturists tell us that the materials used to treat the wood now, they're safer. They don't migrate into the soil. If you do choose to use treated lumber, you can line it if you would like to. There's a big difference between how long a treated would last in a raised bed situation versus untreated. There's also materials like cedar and things like that. Of course, the price goes up a whole lot when we start talking about materials like that. You can use cinder blocks. There's different places around that use sheets of galvanized metal that used to be like bumpers on the interstate and things like that. You can use all kinds of different materials. If you're concerned with lead or what was on the site previously, I would encourage you to do the bed deeper, 12 inches, 18 inches, 24 inches, do it deeper. The width and length, we recommend about 4 feet wide. That allows you to work it from either side without having to walk inside the bed and cause issues with compaction. It can be as long as you want to make it, as long as your materials are, whatever you've got funding for. It can be different configurations. There's no right or wrong answer with the length and the configuration and the materials and things like that. This is a raised bed out in a community garden here in Macon. I think it was about 12 inches deep, and it's a 4 by 16 foot bed. So you can see that folks can easily work it from either side. This is when we put a piece of wood in the middle, and we were doing different treatments on each side with incorporating in some organic material to see which side worked better. These are some beds up in Atlanta. They can be as tall as you want to make them. Of course, the taller you make them, the more soil's got to go in and the more expense you've got there. If you do decide to do a deep bed, if you've got people with mobility issues, or you've got anybody that just could really benefit from having a taller bed, you could put rocks or different types of filler materials in the bottom to help raise it up if you needed to. The picture on the right was actually at a senior village up in Atlanta. So they were a little bit taller to help people with accessibility issues. And then there's things like containerized vegetables. If you've got a back patio, a back deck, a smaller space, people seem to think you've always got to have this big row crop situation and lots of room, but we talk to people in urban spots with limited space. You can grow with what you've got. There's not any restrictions. If you've got some sunlight and some water and you pay a little bit of attention to it, you can have some nice crops wherever you're growing. So the traditional in-ground plantings they're cost effective. You're not having to put a lot of money in for materials. There can be issues if you've got contamination in the soil. It takes a little bit longer to get the organic numbers up, get your organic material up. Working in compost or cover crops or whatever through the years, it does take a little bit longer to get all that built. Raised beds, you start with the great stuff in the beginning, depending on how much money you want to put in for manure and compost and soil. You can plant earlier if it's protected. You're alleviating the soil compaction issues. Likewise, it can be more sensitive to temperature and moisture extremes. You got to stay on top of the watering just a little bit more. And then container gardening, you guys know this too, great for small spaces. You can move it in if we have a late freeze, a late frost, you can move it in and protect it. You got the cost of the materials. You got to be sure you got drainage holes in whatever you're using. And it, of course, is more sensitive to temperature and moisture as well. Choosing the crops is the fun part of this. You've got to know what is appropriate for the season coming up. We're moving into the warm season crops, so we're still a little bit early to be putting warm season stuff in the ground, but you're in the prime preparing and planting spot here. UGA does have a vegetable planting chart that has got spacing and planting dates and cultivars. If you Google, do an internet search of UGA vegetable planting chart, it's got lots of good information on there. There are some that argue that the planting space can be tighter than is recommended on this sheet, and that may be true. I mean, there's things like square foot gardening and different ideas of planting more intensively on a smaller space. If you've been growing for a while, you might want to try to do that and see if you can up your yield some. But it's good to start with the plants spaced out a little bit more for air circulation and good drainage and less competition and things like that. So the summer crops that we typically think of here in Georgia, in middle Georgia, are beans and melons and corn and cucumbers, okra, peppers, peas, sweet potatoes, squash, and tomatoes. I put 2 asterisks by the ones that are typically commonly direct seeded. Of course, when you go to the garden centers, you may see these guys sold as transplants, which is fine. They cost a little bit more money, but these also do well direct seeded. And then sweet potatoes, of course, we know are planted as slips. So they're actually plants started as slips that you plant for sweet potatoes. I did go in and put temperatures beside these, and the reason I put those in there is there's a recommended temperature range. You want the temperatures to be at, for the snap beans, for instance, you want the soil temperature at 4 inches to be 60 degrees, and you want it to be rising for a few days, and then you'll know that it's warm enough to get those in the ground. If we don't have soil temperatures that are warm enough, we get plants that may just kind of sit there and stall. They may be more apt to seed rot, root rot problems. They're going to be weaker starting off and really have to struggle to pull through, if they can pull through and get growing in the summer. So everybody is always chomping at the bit to get things in the ground. It's 75 and sunny outside my window right now. I'd love to be out planting vegetables, working in the yard, but it's really good to hold off just a little bit longer, and let's get things in the ground when they need to be in the ground. And you see that some things actually like even warmer temperatures. Okra, sweet potatoes like it when it's up at 75, even warmer. So we'll talk a little bit about a handful of the more popular vegetables that people like to grow. People love to grow tomatoes, and tomatoes, we get lots of phone calls about tomatoes during the summer. People put lots of time and energy and love into them. And that's one reason I wanted to kind of share some of the things culturally that helped with vegetable gardens to hopefully help get you over the bump. So for tomatoes, we've got 2 distinct types of tomatoes. We've got the determinate varieties, which tend to grow a little bit lower, and we've got the indeterminate, which tend to grow taller. If you like to can or preserve or make salsa, you would probably want the determinate varieties. Some of the more common ones out there are Celebrity and Amelia and Rutgers. They tend to produce their crop all just about at the same time during the growing season. The indeterminate, if you keep the fruit harvested, will produce throughout the growing season. Some of the examples of those varieties are Better Boy and Beefmaster. Cherry tomatoes and grape tomatoes, the smaller cultivars, smaller varieties, always tend to be less problematic. So if you're just starting out with tomatoes or new to tomatoes, you may want to try some of the smaller varieties. For whatever reason, they have less problems with disease and insects, and are just easier to get your feet wet with. I've got on the slide heirlooms versus hybrids. Heirlooms, I have a hard time finding any heirloom transplants around Macon. Typically, you buy the seeds back in the winter. You get the seed catalogs and you buy the heirloom seeds and grow them out in the late winter. Heirloom varieties, we're always told the taste is better. They just taste better than the newer hybrids. The hybrid varieties that we talk about now that are out in our garden centers and sold by Bonnie Plants that we find out at the stores are the ones that offer some level of resistance to a number of fungal diseases and nematodes and things like that. So if you see a variety name on a tag and it's followed by V or F or N, that's a hybrid that's got a certain amount of resistance. So when I say resistance, they're not going to be a surefire, not have any problems, but they'll be a little bit stronger if facing fusarium or verticillium or some of these diseases that are out there. So you've got to decide if you're going to struggle a little bit more with the heirloom varieties with a better taste, or if you want to try the ones that are a little bit stronger, or if you want to do a combination, maybe worth trying a combination. Peppers are another good warm season crop for us here in middle Georgia. They tend to do better when the soil is warm to get them started. However, if we go through any dry spells and high temperatures, we can have problems such as bloom drop and sun scald are some of the common issues. So we've got to keep them watered during our dry periods. There's all kinds of flavors and colors and different varieties. Peppers to me tend to be a little bit easier than tomatoes. And when I say easier, they've got fewer problems, I think, than the tomatoes. Squash are something that everybody loves to grow in the summer. They're a spreading plant. They take a good bit of space. When we talk about squash, we're talking about the yellow and the green varieties, zucchini. They are apt to have problems as well. So if you can keep the plant healthy, keep them growing as healthy as you can, they'll be able to resist a little bit better than weakened plants with issues with soil fertility and water issues and things like that. But they do have problems with powdery mildew and squash vine borers. My coworkers, we talk every summer about all the battles with squash vine borers they have. With all of these crops, you want to pick when they're a little bit younger. You don't want them to reach full maturity and seed out. You want to pick the squash when they're young and tender. Beans do well in warmer temperatures, but they're one of those things, if you remember from the earlier slide, they can start with a little bit cooler soil temperature. They don't tolerate frost well, but they will do a little bit better with a cooler start. Most of the bush beans will give 4 harvests per season. They too taste better and do better and continue to produce better when they're harvested, when they're young and tender. Cucumbers are a great plant. One of my favorite things to eat during the summer. They do well on trellises and fences with the vines held up and the fruit are just allowed to hang. They do have issues with a bitter taste when the soil moisture level is low. So good consistent watering throughout the summer is key as these crops develop. Again, want to harvest it before it gets big and just a little bit less palatable than if you picked it a little bit younger and tender. Oh, sorry, I didn't change my okra picture here. So okra, it thrives with hot temperatures. We need to get it out when it's a little bit hotter. Wouldn't think about putting okra out right now. Once it starts producing, you really do have to go out and harvest it daily because it is such a it just is prolific. It's prolific. So you need to stay on top of harvesting it daily. I mentioned heirlooms and hybrids. There's lots of nuances about each crop. There are recommended cultivars from our horticulturists, from our specialists at UGA. I wanted to point out that we've got a UGA Extension Publications website that's got a whole home garden series. Just about any vegetable you are interested in, there's a 2 or 3 page publication related to varieties and related to problems specific to each particular crop. So if you do an internet search for UGA Extension Publications, anything you need to know about these crops is listed there, easy for you to find with more up-to-date cultivars than we'll go through right here in this presentation today. I mentioned the planting chart earlier. It's another good resource. So the things that it includes, for cucumbers, it tells you how many days to maturity, 60 to 65 days to maturity. Planting spring dates. So these are good general recommendations for when to get them in the ground, April to May the 15th. There's fall planting dates. And then it goes on to tell you how much space to put between plants, how much space to put between rows. Good starting information, good information for beginning gardeners on spacing. Developing your garden plan can be as easy as you want it to be. When we were working out the beds for the Brookdale Resource Center, we had graph paper and we had each square equaling so many feet, and we laid out the whole thing with which crops were going in which beds. We've got 50 raised beds, so just kind of laying it out and knowing what we wanted where and what we didn't want shading out here and different things like that. So there are garden programs online. You can pay for garden programs, for garden plan programs, but it really doesn't have to be complicated. You just need to understand your space as if you decide to do it with graph paper. When you're thinking about where to plant crops, whether you're planting in raised beds or planting in the ground, you need to run the rows from east to west and be sure that your taller plants, your corn and things like that, aren't shading out your shorter plants. So you want the tallest plants on the north side and the shortest on the south. So as the sun moves across the sky, you're getting the maximum coverage for your crops. So Brooklyn said y'all talked about soil testing. I've got a few slides about soil testing. We talk a lot about soil testing, and there's reasons for that. There's a lot of people that don't understand the benefits about soil testing. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about it, and especially for those of you guys who haven't been on here before. Soil testing, where the idea is to take 6 or 8 samples from where your garden site is going to be. If it's less than 5 acres, 6 or 8 samples. You want to dig down and pull soil from about 4 to 8 inches deep. We don't want to pull the soil that's right on the soil surface. We don't want the stuff that's a foot deep. We want the soil where the roots of the plant are going to be growing. You mix those 6 or 8 samples in and you take it into your county extension office, and you'll end up getting a report back. Kind of a convoluted looking report. It's not as user-friendly as it might be able to be. And we talked to quite a few clients about how to interpret the soil report. So you don't really have to understand all the graph on top, but the recommendations section is kind of where the meat of what you need to know is. So this particular sample has a low pH. So the recommendation is to put out 135 pounds of limestone. We'll talk in the next slide or two about pH. And then it goes on to talk about your fertilizer recommendations. So really direct stuff. You can't go to the big box stores or the local feed and seed and them tell you any more directly than this. This is your soil on your site, and this is what you need to know. So with vegetables, most of them prefer slightly acidic soil. So the neutral pH is 7. So most vegetables prefer 6 to 6.5. Irish potatoes, white potatoes, a little bit lower than that. So neutral pH. The reason it needs to be a kind of a neutral pH, if you look at the scale here, we see that around 6 and 6.5, if we look up the bars, the fattest part of the bar falls between the 6 and 7 range on this chart. So that's how available the nutrients are. So if we can keep the pH of the soil in the right range and we put out these fertilizers, these nutrients, the plant roots are going to be able to absorb it. So if we've got really low pH or really high pH, certain nutrients will be able to be absorbed, but not the vast majority. So right around 6.5 is a sweet spot. For us in Georgia, we changed the pH with dolomitic lime. You can either buy pulverized lime or pelletized lime. Sometimes it's called ag lime. You can buy it in 40, 50-pound bags. And you put it out on your soil, and ideally you would do this in the fall so you could till it in or allow it to move down through the soil profile and adjust your pH. If you're doing it this time of year, it's better to try to till it in or work it in so it moves on down through the soil and will be able to change the pH for where the roots of the plants are growing. If you've got to raise your pH, if we've got to lower the pH, we actually do that with sulfur. There are a few fertilizers that help acidify the soil as well, but most of the time we're putting lime out to raise the pH. Y'all probably heard about this, talked about this in some of the prior sessions as well. The nutrients in the fertilizer, the 3 numbers are N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And the numbers tell you what percentage are in the bag. So those 3 numbers are important if your recommendations for 10-10-10 or 34-00 or whatever. There's also lots of good organic fertilizers that can be put out. Black Cow is this composted cow manure. We've got less chance of causing fertilizer burn. Consumers like the idea and are more comfortable with the idea of organic fertilizers. Sometimes it can be a slower release that will release the nutrients over time when compared with the synthetic. So when we talk about the synthetic fertilizers, that would be the 10-10-10. They can be more expensive, the 10-10-10 versus making your own compost and things like that. And one of our horticulturists says, to a plant, nitrogen is nitrogen. So use what's the most affordable and what's the easiest to get your hands on. But there are some good organic options as well. Just as far as growing good soils in general, I couldn't get past this talk without mentioning compost. There are such value to compost, using your own waste from your yard and your landscape, the greens and browns. You can your compost piles, your compost bins don't have to be anything fancy or extravagant. It can be for the Brookdale garden, we've got some pallets set up. It can be a pile in the back of your yard where you're adding stuff to it and turning it periodically. All of those nutrients, if they are allowed to heat up, well, your pile is going to break down and those materials are going to break down, and you're going to have this great stuff to add back to your garden. I put this picture on here. Susan sent this to me a few weeks ago. The bed on the left had been top dressed with compost. The bed on the right did not receive the top dressing of compost, and you can just see the difference in those two crops. They were planted at the same time, they've got the same soil, but just the additional benefit of the compost when top dressed. Nothing scientific about this, no trial that we can say that we took all the other things, all the other variables out, but just an interesting little comparison about benefits of compost. If you've got time with your plot and what you're growing and your compost situation, adding in some manure helps. Even putting top dressing with manure, a site that you're going to plant this time next year, to allow the nutrients to break down. You don't want to put fresh manure out because it can burn your plants. We don't want to use manure from dogs and cats, but horse manure and cow manure and goat manure and sheep manure, anything we may be able to get our hands on, those are valuable fertilizers as well. The one caveat, the one thing I would say to look out for on vegetables in particular, is you want to get manures from sites that don't have any kind of herbicide residue. So the picture of the tomato leaves here, the chlorosis, the discoloration in the center of the leaves at the petiole, is that's a common sign of glyphosate damage. And so if you are using manure from a pasture where the cows were grazing that had been sprayed with an herbicide, it can pass through the digestive system and may not have the time to break down before you put it out on your plants, on your vegetables. So that would be the thing to pay attention to with vegetable gardens. Also, if you're planning ahead and have the time, most of us don't take the time that we need in getting this stuff set up properly, but if you have the time to plan ahead and have a fallow piece of land that you can do some cover cropping on, there's lots of benefits to clover and rye. The clover fixes nitrogen in the soil, so anytime you've got can do a season or two where you cover crop and then work the green material back in, it's increasing the organic material, the biomass, the legumes fix nitrogen. So you're just increasing the value of your soil exponentially if you've got time to do that. Bob Westerfield, one of our vegetable specialists, his rule of thumb, we want to encourage you to do soil testing, but his rule of thumb is that most 1,000 square foot gardens are going to need about 20 to 30 pounds of fertilizer when you get your plants in the ground. Still want you to do the soil testing, but that's just kind of a general rule of thumb. So there's things to think about as we where the rubber meets the road. We've made our plant selections, we've done the preparation, we've done the soil testing. So what happens next? It's good to know what kind of equipment you've got or can get access to. For larger plots, of course, a tractor, a small tractor is helpful. Here in town, we've got places that rent tillers. And there's some of our friends that just like to use a shovel and do it the old-fashioned way. We know that there's some advantages to doing no-till systems where we're not actively breaking up all the soil and the microorganisms in the soil. So if you've got the means to do that, that's a good way to go, the no-till system. But for a lot of us, we've got to do some tilling to get the ground broken up and help with weed control, things like that, get it ready to plant. For our transplants, we want to put them in the ground at the same level as they were growing in the little pots. except for tomatoes. We plant tomatoes deeper, and we want those that will help them establish a good, strong root system as they begin to grow. But for all the other transplants, we want to put them in the ground at the same level of the container. We want to think about planting in successions as well. So we don't want to put all of our seeds or all of our transplants in the ground on the same day for our stand of corn. We want to plant some and then a week or two later come back and plant some more. This is going to help ensure that you're going to have a harvest throughout the season. It'll also help if there's a certain insect or a disease that's going to jump on your corn at a certain stage of the game. It may allow you to have some crops outside of that timeline as well. So successions are a great way to do vegetable gardening. Irrigation, we got to have sun and we've got to have water. So having a close water source is important, so we're not having to lug water in barrels or anything like that. When we're planting from seed, having a moist seed bed twice a day is going to help with germination as plants mature and grow. We can back off of the watering a little bit. Of course, it's going to be variable depending on if we're talking about in-ground or raised beds. And the key with watering most plants is we want to water deeply. We want soil to dry out slightly between watering. When we keep soil continuously moist, that's when we get root rot problems, and we want to try to avoid that if we can. So water deeply, allow it to dry out slightly before you water again. Use your hand, use your finger to see what the moisture level is. If you don't have anything else, real easy way to check. If we can use soaker hoses or drip irrigation, that's going to be better than the overhead irrigation. We've got to use what we've got though. Irrigation's got to happen with these vegetable gardens. So consistency and uniformity is key. We mentioned problems with a couple of the crops earlier, specific problems that happen when they dry out or when we don't have uniform moisture. So some of the things we have access to may be these tripod sprinklers, overhead sprinklers. Right now out at Brookdale, we've got some overhead sprinklers that we're having to use. That was what was cheap and easy to get our hands on when we put this garden in last year. Hopefully we're going to be working towards some drip irrigation and soaker, but again, we've got to have water on there. So if this is what you've got, this is what you go with, this is what you start with. For a smaller garden, things like the soaker hoses are a good, easy way to deliver the water straight to the root zone. One of the issues, well, there's a couple of issues with the overhead watering. One is when it's 100 degrees outside, we're probably losing more than we need to evaporation. It's keeping the leaves of the plants continually moist, so you're making your plants more prone to disease problems. So that's why it's a better idea to get the water delivered right to the root systems of the plants. Soaker hose is a good way to do it. Drip irrigation is another way to do it. This may be practical if you've got a smaller bed. For larger beds, it may, you're not going to be able to buy one of these little slick kits, but you can build out a drip irrigation for a larger space as well. So that has the emitters that put the water right on the roots of the plants. Two easy things that we forget about, or one easy thing that we forget about a lot of the time is a rain gauge. When we're getting adequate amounts of rain, like we are these days here down my way, we probably don't need to be putting on any supplemental water. So something as simple as a rain gauge, if you live out in Thomaston and you're driving an hour to back and forth to work, you may have had a shower at your house that you may not have gotten at work. So just understanding what you got on your garden that day is valuable. Timers are a nice tool to use for those of us who are busy with kids and family and everything else that we do in life. Timers are a good way to make sure the water is getting on and getting delivered when we just run out of sunlight on the days. So something to consider as well. Mulch is something that we need to think about in our gardens. There's different types of mulch. A lot of it will depend on what you've got access to. It may depend on the amount of money your local garden center is selling it for, but anything that's organic and will break down is a good thing. So pine straw, pine bark, grass clippings are kind of questionable. I don't know if you'd want to use them if you've got any type of herbicide in them. Probably not. A lot of times we can start with a layer of several layers, pieces of newspaper or cardboard, and then put the mulch on top of that. And that's kind of serves as a nice weed barrier without getting the plastic or the weed barriers. It's a nice barrier underneath our mulch. The mulch not only helps prevent weeds, it helps to conserve moisture as well. So mulching is a definite in any type of vegetable gardening situation. Other types of weed control other than mulching might be tilling. You can till between rows to help with the weed control. There's also pre-emergent herbicides that you could use. There's caveats with that depending on the crop and whether you're seeding or transplanting. And we've got some recommendations on that. I think I've got that slide coming up, but there are some products that'll help slow down the germination and what's going to pop up in the spring. So if we can keep our plants healthy, we're going to help stave off diseases and problems for a while, but we know they're going to come. I mean, once we hit July and August, we just know they're going to be here. So I wanted to mention integrated pest management, which is basically a holistic program to approaching problems, to preventing the problems, but managing the problems as well when they pop up. So we want to prevent pests. Healthy plants is a good way to prevent pests. Once we know we've got pests, we need to identify them. We need to know, are we dealing with an insect problem, or are we dealing with a fungal problem? Are we dealing with a bacterial problem? We've got to know what we're dealing with in order to figure out how to control it. We need to keep an eye on the situation. We want to catch those squash bugs as eggs before they all hatch and are running amok in our garden. We need to decide what our tolerance level is to controlling the problem. And then when we get to the step where we know we've got to control, are there things that you can do culturally or mechanically, or even for the tomato hornworms, are there any biological cures? Sometimes chemical may be the best strategy, but we always want that to be the last thing we pull out of the toolbox. And once we put some type of control in place, we got to evaluate whether it's working. We can't decide we got a problem, treat the problem, and then step away. It can never happen like that. If one thing we put in place to control the disease on our tomatoes isn't working, we need to be aware and figure out what plan B might be. So just on the cultural and preventative side of things, I would again mention resist planting too early. Let your soil warm up. Be patient. Know it's going to be for the best for most of our crops. This was some sweet potatoes we put out last spring. Our mayor was chomping at the bit to get this garden in the ground. He wanted it in the ground in March. I think we got him delayed until April. But this is a sweet potato that's kind of showing symptoms of cold damage, just kind of weak, having a hard time getting up and getting going. Once the soil warmed up and once the air temperatures warmed up consistently and started moving up and staying up, these guys pulled out of it and were okay, fortunately. The GeorgiaWeather.net, if you're not familiar with it, I would encourage you to jot it down or visit it when you get a chance. There's weather stations throughout the state. It tells you things like your last frost date. This is data for us here in, this is actually the Byron station, which is the closest one to me here in Macon. And you can see the average last frost date for Byron. It's pretty wide ranging. We've got everything from February the 14th through April the 3rd. And we're sitting here now at March the 13th. So I would argue that this might be a good reason to hold off planting just a little bit longer. Hopefully you're not going to get hit, but there's a decent chance you will. The other thing that's on this website, I mentioned in the beginning that soil temperatures are here as well. So I just pulled this today. This is the soil temperature in Byron. I mean, I could get a soil temperature and we could measure it here in Macon and do that if you feel like it and have the means to do it. But in Byron today, the soil temperature at 4 inches is 52 degrees. I was looking at one of the gardening Facebook pages earlier today, and somebody had posted all the at last frost temperatures, and one of the guys commented, well, it's 60 degrees in my soil. I'm putting my plants into the ground today. And, you know, not where we live. I'm not sure where he lived at, but err on the side of caution when we get these warm days in late winter, early spring. Crop rotation is something to mention too. This would be part of a good IPM program. We want to rotate between different families. So we don't want to put our tomatoes and peppers and potatoes in the same bed year after year after year, because similar insects and diseases affect everything, attack everything in that family. So we want to put a tomato there one year, and then we may want to put a cucumber there the next year, and then maybe rotate across to an okra. And that's one way to keep the plant pressure, the disease and pest pressures pushed back a little bit. If you do, again, the same thing year after year after year, you're just building that population that's just gonna eat you alive. So crop rotation means rotating through the different families. Harvest on time. Don't let your crops get so big and hard and rigid. When you're letting the plants and the fruit and the vegetables grow out like that, that's when everything's just going to start to crash, when your plant's going to shut down, when it's going to become weaker. So get that stuff out of there when it's young and tender. Even if you're not eating it or don't have somebody to give it to, get it out of there, put it in the compost pile, and allow your plant to keep producing, keep putting on new blooms. Chemicals are the last resort. We do have a book called the Georgia Pest Management Handbook. If you've got problems with your late blight of tomatoes, you can go in that book, which is also a website, an online resource, and know what are the 2 or 3 options that you could put to protect the rest of your plant from disease spread. I'd also caution for chemicals, the label is the law. The label is the law. The label has got everything on it you need. And it also reminds you that for a good IPM program, proper pest ID is critical. We don't want to be putting out an insecticide for a disease problem and vice versa. We're wasting our time. We're putting that junk out in the environment that's not doing anything to help our vegetable garden program. If a little's good, a lot is better. That's not true either. Label is law. And just another reminder again, the healthier we can keep our plants with nutrition and watering and mulch, the healthier we can keep our plants, the more resistant they're going to be for problems. And I stuck this little cartoon up here to remind me that when we start spraying things like insecticides in our gardens, we're not only affecting the bad guys, we're also affecting all of our beneficial insects as well. The ladybugs that may be working on the aphids, and the wasps that may be working on your tomato hornworms. So there's a place for chemicals, but last resort, and do it according to the label and have things identified. Your product that you choose, what may be granular, it may be spray, it can be as small as a half-gallon spray bottle to a backpack sprayer. It's what you're comfortable with, what you have access to, the cost of the materials. And I wanted to end real quick. I thought this was kind of a funny slide. Don't believe everything you read on the internet, quoted by Buddha with a picture of Abraham Lincoln. We know how much garbage there is out there online, and it's just getting worse and worse by the day. So I wanted to tell you briefly how to do a quick, good internet search to find information related to gardening and organic gardening. We want to try to avoid typing just the general terms in the search engine, and then we want to type the search term in and put, for University of Georgia sites, we can put site:/uga.edu. If at UGA, we like to think we know the best for every subject out there, but there's some things that we may not have all the resources laid out there for you. So I would suggest to do a search for site:/edu. Florida's got some great resources. Clemson, start with Southeast universities and move out, but look at the good research-based information. There are lots of people out there wanting to sell you stuff and will give you the wrong information. So start with a good search. Ask your local county extension office. We're here to help, and we're here to give you the non-biased stuff. So with that, I think that's all I've got, Brooklyn. And if anybody's got questions, I will try to answer them, and I'll just say happy gardening.